So we're going to talk a little bit about creating powerful data security policies. My name is Jennifer McLarnon. I'm the information officer at Boston College High School in Boston, Massachusetts. It's a grade 7 through 12 high school, middle school for boys. My email's here if you want to connect. I'm also interested in talking with anyone who's had a sort of interesting pathway into the field of data security. I know that most of my experience has been in education, so I'm really interested in others' trajectory, how they got into cyber, how they got into data security. So I'm a former teacher turned CIO. I started my career, sorry, my dog's walking around. I call him Click Clack because he constantly is clicking his nails. But anyway, I got my BS in environmental geoscience and then master's in curriculum instruction. And it wasn't until many years later that I went back and got an educational administration master's as well as, and then I got a master's in cybersecurity governance and policy. So I have a strong background in education as a teacher, advisor, coach, moderator. I was on a bunch of committees. I was actually a part of the Teachers Association leadership team before starting a role as Dean of Instructional Technology at BC High on the school side administration for a couple of years. So all of my degrees actually came from Boston College, oddly enough. I went there undergrad with my twin sister and then went back to get my master's there. And most recently, my master's in cyber at the Woods College, which is have an amazing program. So I spent 2 years in ed leadership, and then I moved to the operations side as director of technology. And I think the COO at the time thought that most of the job would be mainly ed tech, but it was very much the other side. It was very much obviously server room, switching, security, firewalls, all that stuff. So I really had no experience with any of that, but I was able to have some success by getting interested into the root cause and having curiosity and following through. And we did a bunch of work on the infrastructure. And so it was really learning trial by fire. So I worked in director of technology for a couple of years, and later my title was changed to information officer because a lot of the things I was doing fell under that title. So I really had to ask my boss for that title change. So I would encourage you all to do it. And I had to wait it out, but eventually they gave me the title change. So it's important to ask for things, right? I think oftentimes as women, we tend not to, but recently I started as an adjunct faculty of cybersecurity at Assumption University, and I'm really enjoying that, speaking with, the 18, 19-year-olds about cybersecurity. I really love helping the young girls in the class. Really have a bias towards them. All right. So when we're talking about our data security policies, right, we want to keep in mind our true north, right? What is framing our work? What are we trying to do, right? We can't lose sight of that, what we are trying to accomplish. And so we're really trying to ensure that the data that we're entrusted with is cared for in the way in which we have, promised to take care of it. So we'll also want to distinguish data privacy and data security. So I would say data privacy is the appropriate use of data, right? It's the covenant that our organization and individuals within our organizations, that they're in fact using the data or information that is entrusted to them according to the laws of the state, any regulations, and the guidelines that are governing it. So for me, in Massachusetts, my guiding framework is legislation 201 CMR 17. It's Massachusetts legislation that requires any company in Massachusetts that uses the personal information of a Massachusetts resident, they must develop a written, regularly audited plan to protect that personal information. So in Massachusetts, we call this a WISP, and it's also short for a Written Information Security Program. So this WISP, and I'll show you, if we have time a little bit later on, I'll show you pieces of our WISP, but it calls for the creation of policies and procedures. And we actually created data security policies for different departments. So admissions has a different one. The nurses and trainers, because they have health information, they have a different one. Fundraising has a different one. We have a Hyde Center that travels internationally. So they collect student passports and health information. We made them their own special policy, as well as finance and athletics. We also created a student records disclosure policy and a confidential information and security policy that all faculty and staff need to abide by. And each department policy provides examples of use cases and examples of data and procedures that are very specific to that team, and they are very much a training tool. So we went back and forth with departments looking for feedback, and I brought all new questions that they brought up back to our lawyer, which we'll talk about more. You really need a lawyer when you're writing these policies, really just to vet and fact check, right? Because you want to make sure you're protecting what the regulations pertaining to your organization, your state or territory, country are requiring you to do. So we had a lot of discussion around personal note-taking in schools, and that took us a while. We finally just nailed down our policy this fall. So it's been years in the making to really come to a policy that we all agreed on, because as you'll see, right, as we talked, a policy can be anything, you put on paper, but it's only going to be effective if it works for you and your organization and the culture in which, it's managing. Okay. So in Massachusetts, it covers electronic and paper records, and the law went into effect in 2010, but I would bet now in 2021 that many organizations in Massachusetts still don't have a WISP. Like ours didn't go into effect until 2019 in March. And we know that in the United States, the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, enforces penalties against companies that don't comply with data privacy laws. So some examples of legislation and compliance are on the next slide, right? We've got COPA, which gives parents control over what information websites can collect about their kids. We have HIPAA that ensures patient confidentiality for all healthcare related data. We've got the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act that mandates how financial institutions must deal with the private information of individuals. So, and there's my statute in Massachusetts, and we've got SOC. So depending on what your line of business is, you need to be in tune to the legislation and regulations that you're accountable to. So if we can talk now about data security, which is a little bit different than data privacy, right? So data security is protecting data or information in its various states, and those are data at rest that is being stored, data that's in use in processing, and then data that is traveling over networks. So emails is a great example. So data at rest, so inactive data stored physically in a database, a data warehouse, a spreadsheet, an archive, a backup, a USB, a hard drive, that's data at rest. And then data at use is actively under change in a database and a spreadsheet, and data in transmission is moving over a network, it's on a computer memory, it's sent over email, it's moving from one USB, horrifyingly enough, to another, or it's moving to the cloud. And many of you probably have heard of the CIA Triad, right? It's a model that we can use to guide information security policies within an organization, and it stands for C, confidentiality. That means data is protected from the disclosure or exposure to unauthorized individuals or systems. So at all times, you have to know that your data is confidential. No one else has access. Integrity is that data or information is whole, complete, and uncorrupted. Oftentimes, this is threatened when it's exposed or it's exposed to potential corruption, sometimes when it's being stored or transmitted. And then the availability of information is, it's accessible and it's formatted correctly, and it's there when we want to use it without interference, without obstruction. So that's what our goal is, right? We're looking for confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data. So in order to ensure that, right, information, we need to know what it is and where it is. And I think that's in organizations, depending on the culture, the size, right, the structure, that's easier said than done. But honestly, that's also the fun part, right? Because that's how you learn all the quirky behavior of your users and their interactions and behaviors of the teams, of the different departments. And, you got to get people talking, So the crown jewels, right? This is often called identifying the crown jewels, the most critical data in your organization. This could be like for me, right? Because Massachusetts says so. It's PI, the personal identifiable information of Massachusetts residents. It's their social security numbers, financial account numbers with their name, date of birth, not necessarily in Massachusetts, but other states, yes, because many of you probably know that the United States doesn't have an overarching data governance laws, right? So each individual state has its own. So, some states might say that date of birth is considered personalized, PI information. So driver's license number, passport information when students travel. If you're a company like Coca-Cola, your intellectual property, the Coke formula, that's a crown jewel. Your health information. And then if you're, FireEye, your hacking tools, that's your crown jewel. So any loss of the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of your crown jewels really can bring your productivity or operations to a screeching halt. It can damage your brand. It can result in fines. You can have lawsuits. It'll lower your share price. In a school like mine, that's any private donor information, right? Student data, private data from students, and then primarily health information. So unearthing these crown jewels, right? You have to get people talking and you have to include everyone. Some of the best conversations I had in my role was when we met with each department and we just sat them down at the table. We got them in a room. I asked them open-ended questions. I gave them time. I was nice to them, right? You can't talk over them, and you don't let them think that they're in trouble, right? You just have to get the information flowing, all right? So how do you do this? So we talked about talking to your data users and your stewards, talk to the departments, ask them what types of data. And it's very interesting to see how they look at each other. And sometimes they're like learning for the first time that that's the way in which some of them interact with the data, right? Some of the practices that they have, some people are shocked that certain practices are still being done. And oftentimes they don't really come to a resolution, right? If there's an outdated question, or if I ask them a direct question, oftentimes they have to circle back and get back to me, which is a good thing in and of itself, right? Not that they don't have the answer, but the fact that we're unearthing a new discovery, right? It's giving us something to talk about. And chances are we're going to end up making an effective policy or an effective change because we're going to safeguard information or we're going to learn more about the processes. So how can you do this? If you're a large organization, you might be able to hire someone to do this for you, to interview your data stewards, right, or your data users. But again, I can't say enough about how you learn so much about their behavior, and then you can later use this to build your policy and for training. And this isn't bad if you like people. I like most of the people that I work with, right? Some of them, we all have our days, but it's like I said, it's fun to get them in a room and just let the conversation get going. It's always good to ask them how they store, how they share, who has access, and of course my dog is starting. So as you start to talk about how they use the data, you can dig a little bit deeper, right? And you can start to look at personal data. And this is just a PowerPoint, an Excel that I've used in the past where it really does a nice job of outlining for them, right? It gives them something concrete to fill in. What do you collect? Why do you collect it? Whose data is it? How often do you do it? Who do you share it with? How long do you retain it? Where is it stored, right? Then when you capture this information, then you can analyze it, right? Who owns it? Who uses it? Do they know anything about retention? When we first started, we didn't have any data policies, data security policies. We didn't have any retention policies. So we're still working on the importance of that. But really analyze access controls. How is this data dependent from one department to the next? And then what are the IT supporting structures around the data? What help do they need from us as your role in IT? And then also collecting this information can later help you create a data map, which will show you how your data flows in, who has access. You can get really particular about tweaking it and making it work for you. Excuse me. Making it work for you you know, making it work for you for whatever it is you're trying to solve. Okay. Yeah. And when you have these discussions with the teams, then you can start to identify different threats to the data. You can also start to think about how you want to classify your data, which is next, and then the obstacles to the protection of that data. We had very interesting conversations about how we would collect data from referees, for example. We would have the referee fill out a piece of paper and write their name, social security number, and then they would just give that piece of paper to a coach, oftentimes a very young coach, and that paper might be in a backpack or on the field. It might blow away. Then it would be delivered at some point to a mailbox in an office that somebody would have to grab and then bring up to finance. So finding out little stories like that is often, you know what it's happening, and you can put a stop to it. You can make it easier, because that poor referee, right? We're thinking about the data that we're collecting on, he or she. And so this isn't really a data map. This is something I was working on for a project about how our data comes in, how many times a year, where it goes, and then how do we refresh it. But it's the beginnings of a data map, right? And I'm sure you could develop a much more detailed data map, again, for the purposes that you need to serve. All right, so classifying your data. It's going to be a decision that you make with your team. You have a little bit of flexibility in nomenclature, what works for your culture, and you might want to have conversations about the data that, if disclosed or breached, would cause the most severe harm to your organization or individuals. And then, if not severe harm, the next lower level may be serious harm, and then certainly what's public versus what might be internal. So any data that's protected by laws and regulations, where if you had a breach, you would have to notify notification that probably might be confidential or restricted. And again, you definitely want to work with a lawyer when you're coming up with your classifications. And you're probably going to want to your data before you write your policy, and you'll see why in a moment. And just like everything in your life or work can't be a priority, everything, all of your data cannot be mission critical, right? You really need to sort it out and break it down into different classifications. So again, data retention is something that you should work with your lawyer, accountant, or auditor to develop the retention schedules and destruction schedules for your particular type of data. If you have technology, you can set those retention schedules in stone. So we used Box, and so when we rolled out Box, we put data retention policies on folders and set those in stone. And you would think it's easy, then the users would just have to put the information in the folders. But the users aren't really thinking about data retention. They don't really know what it is. So the first phase was rolling out the policies, training them on the policies, and they're doing very good. But the next phase is, especially with the managers, talking to them about why data retention is important and why we need to take it serious. And then especially the data with our third parties, right? We need to make sure we're going in and removing that data. And it's also, we need to know what type of data they have. In case they have an incident, we need to know who may need to be notified. Okay. So then the last word I would say on policies would be that our policies and their associated procedures address opportunities, threats, and requirements, and they should set clear expectations for conduct across our organization. So the policy sets the tone of the organization, and the standards we put into our policies are used to control risk, and the guidelines provide much needed guidance for employees. The procedures are our how-tos, the guides for employees, so how to share PII, how and when to disclose and not to disclose student records. And they really must stay true to our core values. But really, leadership must champion our policies in word and deed and demonstrate their commitment to them in order for any policy to be effective. Otherwise, they're just a paper tiger, which I love that saying, right? It's not going to be a forceful policy. It's not going to be a powerful policy unless the policy fits your fits your culture unless you put some thought and energy and effort into it, unless you get the feedback of your data users, unless it has the buy-in of management and they push it down through the ranks. But I would really encourage you to use examples of the actual data in your policy, because it really can be a training tool. So when we were talking about student data, if I pull an English person in off the street into my office and ask them to tell me about student data, he or she's not going to know. So we really did a nice job of outlining what examples of student data is and is not, right? And we had many conversations with the leadership team from academics about all of the ways in which our data is out there, student data. And it was really a great experience, because you learn so much. They get something out of it. They feel like they're a part of it, and it makes for a more powerful policy. So you might want to provide examples in circumstances of which data can be shared and where it's stored, and use your near misses. So a near miss is something that didn't go wrong but really could have, right? An instance where, some custody battles, right? Where a parent may not be able to get the data of a student. That's just an example of a near miss, where you almost shared the information but you didn't. Or you went on a field trip and you came home and your teacher still had all of the copies of the student passports in a folder, and they were going to throw them out in their trash at home instead of shredding them. Things like that. Those are just basic examples, but the more you talk with your users, the more they're going to come forward and say, hey, do you know that this is what so-and-so does? Or whenever we have to share data with this vendor, this is what's going on. So just get out there and talk with them, and then really clarify and list examples again. Be consistent with circumstances. Be clear about actions that they have to take when sharing data, especially if you want them to encrypt data that they're sending over email. And then you really need to review them minimally once a year, but after every incident or near miss. And we've probably reviewed ours, made changes about 4 or 5 times within the last, 3 years or so. But a good policy will take time and collaboration. I think when we finally put out our first policy, it took about 12 to 18 months to do it. Sorry, now I'm seeing your comments about my dog. He's out on the deck. It's a nice day here, so he wanted to be outside. I can't blame him. So I might want to show you now a couple examples from a data policy that we just created, if that's okay. Okay, so this is confidential, right? This is our WIS for Boston College High School. So you can see this is what we have to put out by the state mandate. And it has an introduction and purpose, right? The scope, who it pertains to, and it defines what personal information is. And I keep getting tripped up because when I started, it was PII, but now it's PI. I think, when I hear PI or PII, it means the same thing to me. So in Massachusetts, it's an individual's first and last name or initial and last name with any of this information, their social, their driver's license, their account number, things like that. Whoa. It could be health insurance information. Funny story, when we recently were told that our teachers could get vaccinated with COVID. So we, teachers are teaching during the day. They can't make phone calls. They can't go on CVS. I don't know what it's like for you guys, but trying to get an appointment in CVS was like, people were getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning trying to get the appointment. So some very nice people were having good luck getting appointments at CVS. So people wanted to help. So they sent an email saying, hey, I'm on the CVS site. I can get you an appointment if you send me your name, your health insurance card, and all that information. So it was funny because they know they're not supposed to be putting this information in email and not supposed to be sending it, but in the wake of COVID and whatnot. So I had to be negative Nancy and say, hey guys, you can't put this in an email, right? We know this. So then of course everyone was like, oh my goodness, sorry, didn't mean that. But it's just an example of, PII. Any biometric data, we don't really collect a lot of that, but it does a nice job of outlining what it is. And then in Massachusetts, you have to identify an information security coordinator, and that person has a responsibility, that's myself, of coordinating all of the safeguards that we need to put in place to protect the data. any monitoring, any training, right, which we try to do a lot of. So that outlines everything there. Incident response procedures, how we're going to enforce the WISP. So yeah, we've tied it to the employee handbook, right? And so we've said not a lot, right? But the goal is to have data security responsibility tied to their performance assessments. We're not there yet, but we did have it put in the handbook that they have to do 3 security awareness trainings a year. And not everyone does them, and they don't get written up for it. But hey, it's a step in the right direction. So risk assessment, yep, talks about we'll have to conduct a risk assessment and who's in charge of that. So when we get into particulars like information security policies and procedures, this is where this WISP is the plan, right, the program. But then we went out and we created all these individual policies and procedures for specific departments, specifically tied to encryption, physical security, our classification of data, how to handle information. And then we've got safeguards in place, who's overseeing, and that would be your management, right? And I would have to say getting the manager buy-in is so key to a successful policy because they need to be the champions. Authentication, 2-factor. We had to go back and add 2-factor to the policy to mandate 2-factor because at the time we wrote the policy, we didn't have 2-factor in use. Encrypting information as it travels, specifically emails, and then service provider oversight. That would be many third-party vendors. So how do we verify their security practices? And then incident response monitoring. So that's our WISP. Let me check and see if there's any questions. So really, that's all I really wanted to review. If anybody has any questions, I can answer them. If not, we can break a little early, or I could show you more specific policies. And again, if anybody wants to connect on LinkedIn, happy to swap stories. Just be a part of your network.